Namaste and good evening, everyone. Namaste, Narad.
Namaste. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Sraddhalu.
Namaste and greetings to everybody who's online.
We are happy to continue today, part 196, and we will be taking some more questions that we received on dreams, visions, and out-of-body experiences. But first, a few questions that derives from our last discussion on the extraterrestrial life. You may post your questions during our conversation in the chat box or send an email at integralstudies.in@gmail.com. A first question from Rohan. Assuming it is to be benevolent, what kind of spirituality they might have? How would that be different from what we have on Earth? Would they have the equivalent of Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga, etc.?
Okay. We have already touched upon this on other occasions, so I will not elaborate, but it's a good point to remind ourselves that wherever you have beings that are evolving, and it does not matter too much what is the nature of the biological base of their form. The basis underlying our existence is the 7 planes of consciousness for all that exists in the universe. And therefore the emergence of life in any form is inevitable everywhere, out of matter. The emergence of mind out of life is inevitable. The emergence of higher gradations beyond mind all the way to the supermind is inevitable. And since the underlying principles of consciousness, its unfoldment and its development are universal, all beings, irrespective of the biological basis, would have largely similar trajectories in their spiritual evolution. It does not matter which planet, it does not matter which species. There would be differences depending on the overall turn of temperament. Certain beings might be more predominantly knowledge oriented, others emotion oriented. Some at certain stages might be more physically oriented and others more rationally or intellectually turned at stages. So yes, you would have the Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga, etc. And this is the beauty of Sri Aurobindo's writings, which you do not find, to this extent at least, anywhere else, is that in everything he describes, he goes back to first principles. He goes back to what makes the things become what they are, and why inevitably, therefore, it has to take certain directions. So, the entire framework of the integral yoga as he presents it to us would be, broadly speaking, applicable to all beings on all planets. The only difference might be stages of their development according to which certain aspects of the yoga might be relevant or not. If you look at human beings as they were, let's say 5,000 years ago, where the rational mind had not been activated on this scale to this degree in the largest collective, might have been present in a few. Then the natural leading on certain forms of practice would have been natural. Having acquired reasoning power of a certain degree on the larger scale, naturally priorities and interests would take a different form. Other than that, the principles do not fundamentally change. So if you were speaking to somebody who's still largely emotionally centered, you would not speak of taking a witness poison the mind, because that might not be accessible to that stage of evolution. But you would speak of perhaps standing back from your emotions and taking a poise of calm behind the emotions, which should be the equivalent poise of the witness in the mind, and so on. But assuming then on any planet, the beings have risen up to the rational stage of mind on the larger collective level, everything Sri Aurobindo has written for humanity would apply to them equally and would be relevant, with the exception of specific examples that he may give in texts such as the human cycle or the ideal of human unity, where he will draw upon earth history for examples. But nevertheless, on those planets also there would be equivalent stages or groups which would have gone through similar things inevitably, because that's the nature of reality, that's the nature of the soul, the nature of the divine, the nature of matter and evolution. So yes, to Rohan's question, the answer is simply yes. We can go to the next question.
Narad asked this question: why did the Nazi experiment fail when they selected prime women and men to have children?
This came, I think, in the part when we were discussing the interventions by other beings, higher, lower, or otherwise, to help human species evolve at a genetic or other levels also. Now, if you look back at human history, and if you go back to most of the traditions across the earth, a lot of importance was given to good genes. When marriages were arranged, they would look at the background of the families for culture, but also for sicknesses, illnesses, defects in the biology or psychology. Even the fact that in a particular family some uncle or aunt had lost their mind was considered a negative point for the boy or girl with whom you would get married, because it meant that in the genetics that potential or that weakness was present. Now this is true until, I would even say up to until about 30 years ago. It is still true in many of the more conservative families, where the tradition remains of being conscious of the background and the importance of what you transmit to your children. It has only been lost where the more modern, I will say, fanciful idea of marrying for love, or more likely it is an impulse of emotional attraction. That's what I call fanciful, not true love, but the impulse of emotional attraction. It's only in these spaces and where that has been programmed into us as a reference that this aspect has been set aside or even forgotten. But even today, in the more traditional and conservative families, there's always a great importance given to families. But this being the case, over the centuries, even up millennia, there has been a natural selection through such means to improve the genetic stock. Sri Aurobindo himself makes a comment about this with regard to the genes and the selection of genes. This is in his Thoughts and Aphorisms, where he speaks of two reasons why the modern human being has bad health. First, he says, is bad genetics, because we're no more giving importance to that. And the second, he says, is the reliance on medicine and the faith that has been created that without medicine you can't get well. But that being the case, this importance that he gives again to the genetics is important. So coming back to Narad's question, why did the Nazi experiment fail when they selected prime women and men to have children? It requires a little bit of an elaboration. I've spoken about it many discussions ago when we spoke about the effort of the Nazi phase. And one of the points I think I had made in passing was that at some stage they had gathered what they considered the best genetics for men as well as women. They were tested in every possible way, and I think it was a selection of 30 men and 30 women, which was to be the basis for, in their vocabulary, Sonnenkinder, children of the sun, or sun children. And I gave this example how Sri Aurobindo in here was writing about the sun-eyed children of a marvelous dawn, and that ideal had been captured also or foreseen by other groups. and even the similar vocabulary. And their idea was to breed the best of what could be the basis for a future superior humanity and a superior, what to them was understood to be also spiritually superior. So to Narad's question, why did the experiment fail? My response will maybe a bit controversial. I will say, we don't know if it failed. Because what happened, and this is the evidence we have, those people were assembled and then they vanished. That is, there is no trace left of what was done to them, what they did, or where they went. We do know that a large part of the Nazi elite shifted to the South American countries, particularly the western coast, and I believe in several of the countries, in fact, some of them into mountainous regions where they formed communities which exist to this day, some of them still carrying the symbols of the Nazi phase, but there are some kind of idealistic communities with this idea of breeding the perfect race, master race, and all those things have been retained. But there is also a kind of a spiritual direction, as it seems, was there even in that phase. I don't know to what extent it is still the same, to what extent it is mixed. That is irrelevant. The point being that it's very likely that these were taken there or to some other place which is not so well known and publicly spoken about. And so we don't know whether it failed. Maybe they did produce a superior, at least genetic basis. But the point for us from a consciousness perspective is the genetic base is only the base. It is finally the consciousness effort which makes for the spiritual evolution. It helps that you have a good genetic base, which is strong, healthy, flexible, conscious, rich, diverse, etc. This was the effort the mother made in the physical training in the ashram school, where she even gives this declared objective. I'm paraphrasing. The body must be made strong, healthy, supple, conscious, etc. And then she says, so that when the time comes, a perfect beauty and consciousness can express itself through it. Something to that effect. But you see, the basic idea is the biological base being made a fit vehicle so that when the time comes, that phrase is exact, that higher consciousness could manifest. So yes, perhaps somewhere on earth there are groups which have, not just the Nazi, others also, who have by conscious, careful effort built vehicles which are reasonably good. The question now is whether that spiritual content can be brought in. Has it been brought in? I don't know. You will also remember the mother's comment when the Russian gymnasts came. Of course, at that time, heavily under communist influence, there was no spirituality. They were here on a goodwill exchange, which today we might call a propaganda campaign, but nevertheless very valuable. We had the best gymnasts demonstrating their capacities, and the mother took a lot of care in interaction with them, and later apparently she commented that their body was so well developed and so conscious that if they had a little bit of the spirituality, they would have been like the gods. So yes, did it work out with those people or the Nazi groups or others which wanted to do this? We don't really know. Perhaps it did succeed, perhaps it didn't. The point though is, we have to be conscious. And it does not matter too much if your genetics is not perfect or optimized. What is important is that you can work on your body consciousness and override whatever limitations are there, and especially at a stage when the body is still plastic. There are things you can do to correct for the genetics and override any inherited defects. In principle, without limits. I've shared many times before the example of Arnold Schwarzenegger, who started as the most sickly, weak, unhealthy child, and somewhere the soul quality one day just pushed forward strongly. I think at the age of 10 or 11, he just looked at the future and said, I'm going to become the strongest man in the world. Fortunately, I think he would not have spoken about it. If he did, people would have broken that faith. But what he did do was he put himself through a disciplined and organized framework of physical training and actually became the strongest man in the world, but also most healthy and conscious and plastic within the domain of what was possible in his efforts. So my point is, you can override your genetics. Of course, it helps to have good genetics to begin with, but even if you don't, work on your body consciousness. Everything can be changed. And don't believe the old and erroneous science that says your genes are what make you. Even the more modern, more conscious science actually says it's about epigenetics, not genetics. Epigenetics modifies your genetics or controls the genetic switches to switch on or switch off or even change your genetics. I will take it one step further. It's not even epigenetics, it is consciousness which controls the epigenetic switches. So work on the body consciousness through your mind, emotion, life force, etc., and by opening to a higher spiritual action in the body consciousness, and all this is possible. And there is a comment from Narad which he has just messaged. He says, Sri Aurobindo told Dilip Kumar Roy, the earth is a conscious being and the world is only the form it takes to manifest. Are there other worlds also? Yes, of course. Yes, and in fact we touched upon this in passing, that every planet has a presiding consciousness behind, which is not only the basis for the astrology, it is also a basis for understanding the types of mental beings, or Manu as a generic term, of evolution that takes place on each planet. We can go to the next question.
Emilian, he's writing, he's addressing two questions. So first, comment. I would like to confirm with Sraddhalu what he said last week. Last summer, I was able to observe the moon with a friend's telescope, and I actually saw a craft crossing the moon from one side to the other with a perfectly straight trajectory. I had intended to see one, especially since I had just finished reading Penetration by Ingo Swann. The machine took between 3 and 5 seconds to move from one side to the other.
Right. Fascinating. So Emilian is confirming that he saw, while watching the moon through a telescope, a craft go straight across, straight line taking about, let's say, at most 5 seconds to cross the moon. Of course, one thing you have to be very careful. This is, we can generally accept, yes, it's possible. But if you had to say that this is actually an ET craft, one would have to do back some research to verify that there was no satellite which passed at that time on that location and so on. So when, for example, Stephen Greer does his evenings out staring at the sky looking for ETs and so on, they generally take some kind of software that tracks all the satellites, and when you see something, you have to check on the software that there was no other satellite or flight taking place in that area and so on, as a way of being absolutely sure. But I think we would like to believe that what Emilian saw was that, because also there was this aspiration to see it. So I think I find this very interesting, this confirmation. We can go to his next question.
I would like to have clarification on a text from the mother in Mother's Agenda, February 1972. In parentheses, yes, in 50 years, the whole world, all the receptive section of humanity, I'm not saying the intellectual, I'm saying the receptive, all the receptive section of the world will be not embraced, absorbed in the power of Sri Aurobindo's thought. Those who already are, have the good fortune of being the first ones. That's all. Silence. It is very interesting, you know. The greater part live in the past. A good number, they are more interesting, live in the present. And just a few, an infinitesimal number, live in the future. That's true. Whenever I look at people and things, I always get the feeling of going backwards. Gesture of turning around and looking behind, in parentheses. I know it's not even I know or I feel quoted. It's none of that. I am ahead. In consciousness, I'm in the year 2000. So I know how things will be. End, dots, mother laughs, in parentheses. It's very interesting. Long silence. 3/4 of humanity are obsolete. Now the question of Emilian is, what did their mother mean by this? I would like to take this message to thank you for the enlightening on these subjects and at the same time answering all the questions that I asked myself.
Okay. So his question is about what did mother mean by this? This being the statement, 3/4 of humanity is obsolete. The full text Alina has already read. You'll find there 3 important ideas. First, she says that in 50 years, the whole world, all the receptive section of humanity will be embraced, absorbed in the power of Sri Aurobindo's thought. Now that's 1972, so we have actually crossed the 50-year point around now. But what she says is receptive section of humanity. And she explicitly says, I am not saying intellectual, I am saying receptive. So all the receptive section of humanity will be absorbed in the power of Sri Aurobindo's thought. So I think that's important. It doesn't mean they will know Sri Aurobindo necessarily. It doesn't mean that they will have read of Sri Aurobindo or even heard of him necessarily. Perhaps they might. But if they have been absorbed in that power of his thought, when they do read, they will say, yes, this is familiar. They will recognize the vibration. So we are at that point, 50 years thence, when, and then she says, those who already are absorbed in his thought have the good fortune of being the first ones. That's all. So I would just leave this as an indication of whether we have some good fortune or not. What do we do with it, though, is still ours to do. But that is the first point. The second point, she says, is that when she looks at people, the greater part live in the past. Those who are more interesting, a good number, live in the present. And just a few, an infinitesimal number, live in the future. So it's a question we have to ask ourselves. Are we living with the greater part in the past? Or a good number which are more interesting, are we living in the present? And maybe just a few live in the future. And even if we don't, but at least we can look towards the future being more in the present. That is a choice we can make. And again, I'm highlighting this so that you can be more conscious of where you are and which direction you are going. The third point she makes, she says, wherever I look at people and things, I always get the feeling of going backwards, turning around and looking behind. Yeah? So, and she says, she knows, she feels, she is. She says, I am ahead. In consciousness, I am in the year 2000. That's 1972, so she's already, let's say, 30 years ahead. She knows how things will be, being in that consciousness. And then she comments, 3/4 of humanity is obsolete. And this is a statement she had made. She is not only here in the agenda, she had told this to Huta also, and Huta narrated it to me. So the point, and this statement I have perhaps quoted a couple of times. In one talk which I had given in the United States, I had with a different group, and I had made this observation and I had put it in context. But when they released it in public, they found it too embarrassing to put it. They actually edited out the statement that the mother said 3/4 of humanity is obsolete. Because it's very troubling. It's very troubling if we misunderstand and if we don't understand correctly what she means. But it is obvious in the context, those who are living in the past and even for the past, and by values which belong to the past stage of human evolution. It does not matter what they do or don't do, because they are not contributing to this forward impulse of nature. They are not even participating in it. And certainly they do not participate in the future consciousness that is dawning, the new world that is manifesting. By clinging to the past, they are actually delaying the dawning of the new consciousness and the future. Those who belong to the present, let's say, a good number and which are more interesting, at least to that extent, you're not dragging back. But you could at least turn towards the future, work to embody or at least give greater importance to the values of the new consciousness. And in so doing, you will actually begin to assist its activation, its actualization, its embodiment, its realization. So when she says 3/4 of humanity are obsolete, that's the part which is living in the past, looking back at the past, trying to still cling to things which are breaking apart. Sri Aurobindo's observation comes to mind, where he says that in this transition from one age to the next, there's a breakdown of all the things which belong to the past. There is the, let's say, initiation of things which belong to the future, and in between you have a kind of a vacuum. And he says the wise person is one who knows what to cling to and what to let go. Because the mistake we will tend to make is to cling to the forms of the past. And in so doing, we tend to be broken down as those forms are breaking. If you can let go of all that is being broken and actually cling to the new consciousness, you will find the content of the past that is relevant being reactivated or renewed or reinvigorated by the new consciousness. And sometimes rebuilding a form which was familiar to the past, but now with this new freshness. Or at other times discarding that form and building a new form out of it. But if you cling to the new consciousness, then the form itself is not so important and you will grow with it. And even if it needs a new form, you will acquire it. What that means, clinging to the new consciousness, letting go of the past, and not letting go of what is precious, which was present in the past, that is something you have to, let's say, introspect, feel, know. But if you don't know and do not wish to make that effort, just cling to that which is for you the thing that represents the presence of the divine, the presence of the Divine Mother. And do not worry if things break around you. Cling to that and trust that new forms and new circumstances will be built around. So what did Mother mean by 3/4 of humanity is obsolete? It is this. It does not matter whether they are on earth or not, because what they do is not helping in any way the impulse of evolution. And it's a bit like dinosaurs. You could have dinosaurs today and maybe it's a novelty in a zoo, but you look at them and they don't have the consciousness that is relevant for the future, and so nature dropped them. But if today dinosaurs were present in the form and you could engage with them and help them to become more mentalized, perhaps that would be a new step, a new direction in which maybe those species could again have a relevance. You see, it always boils down to consciousness and not forms. So understood in this way, you can see where we are and also make a choice for yourself of where you choose to belong. We can go to the next question.
Revati. I have a very vivid memory of a dream in which I met the Divine Mother. It felt like a 360-degree view, She was all dressed in white, wearing a piece of cloth over her head. She spoke a sentence that I could recognize was very much her voice. I did eagerly grasp those divine hands, but couldn't feel them. Several days after the dream, I came across on YouTube a painting by Huta. To my utter shock, it was very similar to what I saw in my dream. The only difference being that in the background, I additionally saw a big building. Was this just a mere dream, or was it indeed the real world, the subtle physical perhaps? I also read an experience of a sadhak stating that Sri Aurobindo is presently in the subtle physical. Would it be possible to train oneself to consciously enter these worlds? Should one do it at all? If so, how can one achieve this?
Yes, it's a good question. There are several parts to the question. The first part is the dream experience itself. And what I find fascinating is this description from Revati, where she says it felt like a 360-degree view. That means you were conscious seeing in all directions. Now, this is not something you can imagine. This is not something that is rising out of subconscious impulse, which is what most of the dream content tends to be. This is typically what happens when you're in the subtle body, out of your physical body. Because in the subtle body, you are not bound to organs as in the biology. It is the substance of consciousness is much more free, much more fluid, indirect. And therefore, every part of your body is conscious with all five senses. And while you do have a form depending on the gradation on which you have come out, let's say you are in the vital or even subtle physical and vital ranges, you have a form, you have hands, you have fingers. But in all parts you're conscious, and through all parts you're aware. So you have a 360-degree view. You're seeing behind, side, front, everywhere at all simultaneously. This description itself is evidence that what you had was not a mere dream. Not that there's such a thing as mere dream. Every dream is, in a sense, an experience on some other level, but still. It was not just a lucid dream, which is a dream where one becomes conscious that you're dreaming, but still you're in a dream, so in a kind of a half awake, half asleep state. You were actually in the subtle body in which this experience took place. So in the vocabulary that Sri Aurobindo uses, we would call this a dream experience, dream-experience, because it's taking place in the night state. You are, your physical body is asleep, you are in a different grade of consciousness, and you have an experience. But as an experience, it's a real experience. Sri Aurobindo uses the phrase from Sanskrit called Swapna Samadhi. So I'm taking time to lay out all these things because this will be the theme for our discussion, not only today, but probably a couple more sessions in this direction that we will explore. So first of all, recognize this was a real experience. Your consciousness was out of the body, in the subtle body. What you saw of the mother with a cloth covering her head is also interesting. I don't know what that image you had, but I do remember an incident where somebody saw the mother, and the first time, maybe it was in the train, maybe it was Amal Kiran, I'm not sure now, but the form was described as wearing what is called a kitty cap in the ashram. It's this band which goes around and holds the hair together. It's specially designed by the mother for the girls who were doing physical activities, so gymnastics, athletics, to hold the hair together. It's something she created herself, and so girls here wear it during the physical programs. But many people have seen her. The mother herself would wear it when she played tennis, so that's where you can see a good picture of that. But the person who saw the mother with that found that an unusual headdress, and when it was reported to the mother, I think it was reported to the mother, and she said yes, it was the form in which she is in action. So I don't know what it was as you saw as the cloth covering the head, but it's generally the form in which in the subtle world, in the subtle physical, she is in action. So what you saw as the painting by Huta would be very similar. And additionally you saw in the big building, which building also was the context of that meeting that you had. So it was not mere dream, indeed in the subtle physical very likely that this happened. And so the second part of the question is about Sri Aurobindo being in the subtle physical, yes, and the mother confirmed it. We would assume the mother herself is also in the subtle physical, because that's the gradation which is closest to the material physical, and yet in the subtle, where to the level at which Sri Aurobindo has brought down the supramental consciousness as and transformed substantially his own body. Now, the next part is what now I want to point to, which becomes also part of the theme of our further discussions. Revati asks, would it be possible to train oneself to consciously enter these worlds? Yes, absolutely. And as we develop this theme, we will explore a little bit of what can be done, how it can be done, and particularly the mother's own guidance on this. And I will keep much of that part of the discussion for next time. But so I'll keep some part of this discussion as a continuation into the next. The mother herself gives instructions on how it can be done and what to do when you find yourself out of the body, and how she says if you come to her, she'll actually take you and show you ranges of the higher and subtler worlds. So yes, it is possible to train yourself consciously to enter these worlds. Next part of her question is, should one do it at all? That depends on you. Some people find themselves called to do it because it interests them so passionately. Some people find it interesting to read about, to think about, to experiment and explore and then drop it. Or some people have a knack, so it happens easily, others don't. And so they try for a while, it doesn't work, they give up. So a lot of this depends on your interest, your commitment, but also recognize it is not central to the purpose of the sadhana. So you may choose to prioritize the sadhana over this kind of an experience, or you could treat it as part of the sadhana and explore to the extent that it's relevant within the sadhana. So if so, her question, how can one achieve this? So how to do this, how to go out of the body, etc. We will keep a large part of the discussion for next time. But for this time, I will just indicate this, that yes, it is possible. You can choose to do it. You can choose to explore and drop it. You can choose to explore and pursue it. You can treat it as separate from your sadhana. You can treat it as part of your general spiritual progression. But then the point would come where there will be a choice to be made. How much energy you give to push developing this further, and how much to developing the others. I have shared my own experience before, and maybe I can repeat, that at a certain time in my teenage, when I was reading a lot about these things, and it was almost compelling that I had to convince myself also through validation of experience. I had a few interesting experiences. I did the effort needed to do it. I did not pursue it, I dropped it. So one of the key experiences I had, which was this, because it corresponds to this 360-degree view, it was in the afternoon. During the nap, I found myself conscious outside on the road in the subtle body with the full sun, etc. And the awakening and to become conscious of being in that was such an excitement that I woke up from the excitement. But what happened was, in that state, I had the 360-degree view. And as I came back, I was pulled into the physical body. It was literally the 360-degree view narrowing to the point where it became like a tunnel, and then closed to the point where it was sight covered by eyelids, because the physical body had closed eyelids. So that continuity of consciousness and of vision was the interesting thing. So I was in that body, I was in this body, and the sight in that, and the sight in this, and the continuity across, with no loss at all, no blanking anywhere. And it was important because from that point at least I could say, yes, these are true, although I knew, but still to be able to say from experience has a different power. There were a few other experiences of that kind, but somewhere there was a difficulty in the demand that it made, because I don't have it naturally, that I had to make a certain effort to pursue that line of exploration. And somewhere I felt within that it was not aligned to the soul's sanction, I will say, the sanction of the psychic being. If I had to articulate in mental terms, I would say I would probably have misused it, but also that somewhere the feel was that I should wait, that at some point later it would be relevant perhaps, but not at that point. So, and much later or more recently somehow that sanction did come. It said, okay, it doesn't matter now if you do or not. So again, I began to play a bit with it. And that's in one of those efforts that I had that experience when I was in one experience that Mark Oban saw me. He was in France, he saw me in this, and later when we met, he accurately described what I was trying to do, which was quite an amazing thing. And so that I have noted in my preface to this particular book, which you can buy on the Dipti Publications website. But we'll have more to discuss about this, as well as the method and nature of those experiences. So this, I think we'll pause with Revati's question here. Go to the next question then.
So actually we have a question on this book of Marco Byrne. I have read the first 100 pages of 0.001 experience of reality. Interesting perspective. How does OBE help my present day life other than accepting other realities of universe? How does it help in divinizing the earth? Why does humanity have these OBE abilities? Is there a special purpose? From Blue Lotus Mom.
We can also read the next question. It's connected.
Frederick, could you explain to us how out-of-body travel can help us in the integral yoga?
Okay. So both questions in the same broad direction. So Blue Lotus Mom is asking, how does having out-of-body experiences help in the present day life other than accepting other realities of the universe? I would simply say even the fact of accepting other realities, or rather experiencing other gradations of consciousness, worlds or dimensions, if we had to use that phrase, in the universe is revolutionary from an experiential point of view, because it changes you. You are no more the same. So it's not merely an idea, oh yes, there are other things. The experience of being in another state, of experiencing reality of the universe on another level, it changes you fundamentally. So from a experiential perspective, it's not just understanding. Understanding you can have just from reading. The experience of it suddenly makes you realize there is so much more to it. This is what happens to many people when they have a first experience using psychoactive drugs. The first time they have an experience with psychoactive drugs, suddenly they experience that there is more to reality than just this. Because at that point, certain boundaries of your consciousness have been, let's say, broken. You're exposed to a widened consciousness, not necessarily healthy. Sometimes it can be in the lower vital ranges, or any of the, typically they are in the vital ranges, because all plant-based substances tap into that grade of consciousness. The fact that you experience something wider, the fact that you have perceptions of other levels and gradations, you are no more the same person after that. Now, I will not recommend this. It is extremely dangerous. It is extremely harmful from a spiritual perspective, and it can be damaging even to your nervous system and biology. So, I'm explaining what would be the benefit for those who have had that, but do not ever accept that as your way of having these experiences. There are much more direct and simple methods to have a more complete experience. These are inherently dangerous. I do know of cases where the biology was strong enough and a brief experience was even helpful for the person to break out of this very narrow, shut consciousness bound in the physical body. It broke that barrier, and then it opened them to the spiritual life, and of course they never went back to the drugs thereafter. But this is just to state that this would be the benefit for those who have that very rigid, narrow binding. And this is what happens. Having experienced something more, you are not the same person after that. So it's not just a question of accepting other realities. But we come to the more important part of the question, which she asks, how does it help in divinizing the earth? And why does humanity have this out-of-body ability? Is there a special purpose? So I'll take the second part first. Why does humanity have this ability? Is there a special purpose? Look at it in this way. All of us experience an out-of-body state when we sleep every night. It's just that that state is being experienced in a state of consciousness which is somnambulist, semi-conscious or sleeping. But we have an out-of-body state, all of us without exception. So literally one can say if the subtle body and the physical body are joined together in our waking state, in the sleep state, the subtle body slightly disengages and floats above. Typically, slight separation is enough for the subtle body now to plug into its own world and draw material, regenerating substance, life force, etc., for the healing of itself as well as the gross physical body. So, as an ability, it is there in all of us inherently. The fact that you are much more the subtle body than the gross physical body means that one way or other that ability will be there, or that experience will be there as part of your reality. It happens at night in your sleep state. So to why humanity has this, all beings have it, including non-humans, including extraterrestrials of course, but including animals. Even animals in a sleep state have, depending on the degree of their individualization, a partial or more complete separation from the subtle, from the physical. You will remember the mother sharing this example of how one of her dogs, I think it was the dog which was in Tlemcen with the during her time in Algeria when she was training for occultism with Monsieur and Madame Théon. The dog that they had also developed the ability to go out of the body, and on one particular case when she was in a semi-trance state, the dog came in the subtle body and with its wet nose nudged her to wake up and it's time to go for a walk. So she comes out of the trance, looks at the dog which is still sleeping. So in the subtle body he had come to her and nudged her, which was sensed as this wet nose by her subtle body. So yes, this also can happen. When you see sometimes dogs sleeping, you will see their body twitching, their legs moving as if they are running, and that's actually what they are doing in the subtle body at that moment. So the fact that we are first and foremost the subtle body which has a gross physical body to incarnate means that we can have freely experiences of that grade separate from the gross physical. So as an ability it should be there if we have any sufficient individualization of the subtle bodies. So to the answer of why humanity has this, all have it. How does it help in divinizing the earth? And I link it to Frederick's question, how out-of-body travel can help in the integral yoga. So first point is, it is not necessary. The second point then, if you do have it, you can use it to help. The specifics we will get to, but understand that even without having an out-of-body experience, you can continue the integral yoga. What will happen as a consequence of growth of consciousness, as a consequence of individualization of your gradation, higher levels of consciousness, as a consequence of building continuity across levels or bodies of consciousness, you will automatically find yourself being more aware, let's say during dream state first, and then subsequently in out-of-body, either lucid dream states or out-of-body experiences. And they're different, all of these. But as a consequence of this development, that would happen. It doesn't mean it happens to everybody. It doesn't mean it has to happen either. Some people have a proclivity, a tendency, and so it may happen more easily or more frequently. But even if you did nothing, you will eventually have certain experiences of that kind. If nothing else, you may have an equivalent experience in a state of deep trance or meditation, where you will find your consciousness freed from the body sufficiently to be able to perceive, to sense, even to act upon other levels of consciousness, again without going out of body. But once you're able to do that, the choice to actually project yourself out of the body becomes relatively easy. So the distinction between these two is very important, and this is core of this question about integral yoga and relation to divinizing of matter. Look at it this way. We have a series of gradations of consciousness that form the totality that is us. We are mostly conscious and awake in the lower ranges of the mind, higher and inner ranges we are not aware. Consciousness exists, but we on the surface are not aware of that. This translates into two things. First, a lack of continuity or link between these. And this is something I've discussed extensively in one of the talks which in this series, which was called Building Bridges, Veils and Building Bridges, something of that kind. You'll have keyword veils and bridges, you'll find that those two talks. The lack of continuity of consciousness means that, let's say in dream state, you may actually have an experience in your subtle body. You may have a partial projection, you may have an actual exteriorization, which is the correct word Sri Aurobindo uses for out-of-body experience. And you may come back and have no recollection of it. This is in fact the case for most of us in dream state. Now it doesn't mean you have a full out-of-body experience, it may be a partial or full, irrespective. On a return you have no memory of it because of lack of continuity. So you could actually go to sleep with an intention, have an interesting experience, come back and have no recollection of it. This is the commonest fact. The second point, which is more specific to the integral yoga and the importance of divinization, is that your consciousness in those levels is not sufficiently individualized, is not sufficiently organized, is not sufficiently developed. Any one of these two being the case, you will not remember, you will not recall, or you will not have those experiences. If you have these two sufficiently developed, it doesn't mean you will necessarily have an out-of-body experience or that you will always remember every time. But when you choose to, you can have it or recall to some partial degree at least. I'll give an example here which I've given before. It was when I was traveling. I can even share it was in a space which was very sacred, very clear and pure. I was at that time visiting Llewellyn in the United States, and I was in a house which was part of his community, let's say. And it had very clear, very pure atmosphere. So the side effect of that was the sleep quality was a bit different, and the recall was also a bit different. So I remember one day waking up, and as I'm waking up, I'm crossing a certain grade of consciousness. And I remembered in that grade that the night before I had a clear memory of being with the mother, not as a dream, but a vivid memory of being present with her. And the image and the fact that I was telling her something and she was sitting, I think her posture was like this, as if her chin resting on one arm and the other arm straight like this on the table. I was across the table and she was listening with great intensity, and I was narrating something, some report that I was giving. That's all. I remember this in that passage. I said, my God, it happened the previous night and I had forgotten, and this time I have to ensure I remember it so that I don't lose the memory of it. And then as I cross that layer approaching the physical, the memory fades out. And I'm clinging to the memory trying to recall when I actually half woke, the tail end of the memory remained. When I fully woke, it was gone. The next night, exact same thing happens. As I'm waking up, I pass this layer. Obviously, it took place in that layer. So the memory was strongest in that layer. And suddenly I remember this, and I remember the night before I could not retain the memory. And this time I make a special effort, just clinging to the memory, and finally come to the surface layer with full recall. I say, wow, this time I will not forget. I go and have a shower and come back, and it's gone. And then something happened in the day, and suddenly the memory got triggered again, and it came back because I had brought it all the way to the surface. This is going to be critical to some part of our discussion, which we will have perhaps next time when we discuss of how such a thing can be had or what it involves. It's a fascinating topic, and it requires its own elaboration. But you see here a good example. An experience in a certain grade, but that grade not sufficiently integrated with the surface. And even when recalled and an effort made to bring it to the surface, how much difficulty there was. This is the problem most of us have. So you could have experiences, you could have sometimes very interesting experiences. You will wake up with the sense that something important happened, but I don't remember. You've been to a space, let's say in an semi-out of body state, and we'll have to make a distinction between a partial projection and a full exteriorization. But being in that state, you may have wandered into some of the very beautiful worlds in the vital worlds. Mother narrates in one of those worlds, for example, she says you take a single grape and it gives you all the nourishment you need for a whole week, full of energy and life force. You're totally fresh and regenerated. You come back, all memory of this has gone, you wake up and you say, oh, today I'm feeling so fresh and so energetic. What happened? What did you do? How did this happen, this freshness? No recollection. You'll just say, I had good sleep. That's all. And all this I'm explaining and sharing to make you understand that actually many of us do have experiences, but we are half asleep, so registration is partial, or lack of integration, so the experience is blurred, and lack of awakening or development of those layers, so the experience is blurred, and you are in a kind of a partial registration. Feel good, but what happened, I don't really know. If at all there's memory, it would be something blurred like this. So, how does it help in divinizing the earth, and what is the relevance in the integral yoga? First, in the relevance of integral yoga directly, it means you need to develop all the ranges of your consciousness. This being the narrow band of our awareness, very narrow. Everything below is subconscious. Everything above is superconscious. Everything behind is subliminal, held behind a veil. We live in this little patch. One of the objectives of the integral yoga is to become fully conscious on all the ranges of consciousness, especially the higher and inner first. If nothing else, to become conscious of your psychic being as a first significant step, or its influence at least, would imply already a deepening into inner ranges, which when sufficiently completed would mean the breaking of the veil and the full emergence of the psychic being itself or its influence in a direct conscious way. But with it, with the breaking of the veil, would also be the awareness of these inner ranges. Again, it may happen in a narrow grade first and then widen into all the ranges, which means practically again the inner mind, inner vital, inner physical. All these have to become fully conscious to their entire infinity in consciousness. If you have not done this as a first base, the opening to the supramental consciousness is not possible, and you cannot be in the phase that we would call the supramental yoga. Okay, so this is like a precursor, a first requirement to be able to even get to that point, and without which it is not even the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo. It's a preparation for the integral yoga. Okay. So this being a necessity, one of the consequences of this would be the ability to be conscious on those levels, to be able to recall and retain continuity of consciousness, and to be able to project yourself partially or fully on those levels. Second point, to become sufficiently organized in these planes of consciousness, that you are not just in a blurred state when you open to a higher or inner superconscious or subliminal range. Which, as we are today, if we were to do this, we would enter into this blurred state, and you come out from that, oh, what happened? Was I even asleep? I don't know. But I was conscious. I was not sleeping, and yet it feels like I was asleep. But it felt good. Can you be conscious and not in this blurry, foggy, fuzzy kind of awareness? And I'm making a distinction between this and actually being in a consciousness that opens to infinity. It's not narrow, it's not limited. So you have at first a sense of a widening, but it's not a blurring. Unfortunately, as we are today, the widening is accompanied by a blurring. And we stay with the blurring, or we say, this is not the way I should be. And you come back to your narrow conscious awareness. That was blurring. I think I was sleeping. You snap right back. And you just lost an opportunity to enter a deeper or higher range of consciousness. By persisting, by opening in those states, that you will grow into consciousness and then eventually live even in a consciousness which actually opens out to infinity on the inner or higher ranges. And it doesn't need a great spiritual development for that. You open to that. And with it already many things become possible. But my point is, becoming conscious on these inner and higher ranges is an objective and requirement in the perfection of your consciousness, and particularly 2 reasons for the transformation of the physical, if that be our goal. That experiences of the inner and higher now need to be brought all the way to the most material and infused into the physical, and the physical consciousness itself transformed in its terms. So obviously eventually it's the supramental that you will connect with, but before that, whatever you touch on a deeper or a higher range, we want to bring it all the way to integrate with the physical, which means building continuity of consciousness. So if you're in that state and you come back and you have loss of continuity, loss of memory, how do you even expect the influence to come all the way through, if you cannot maintain just a continuity? What does happen even when you have an out-of-body experience and you have been into higher ranges, in the out-of-body state, even in, let's say, in the higher vital worlds, very beautiful experience, you come back, there's a loss, there's a gap, especially the physical body and the physical brain being so dull. There's actually a transfer of memory that needs to be made consciously. Otherwise, much is lost. That transfer made, you can then wake up and still recall what happened. Otherwise, you will wake up and have a blurred memory. But even if you have a blurred memory, the impact of what was experienced would be held in the physical body. Your body will feel glowing for a while, for a day, 2, 3 maybe perhaps, depending on what you accessed. And then it fades out. So an influence did come, it hit the body, but like a reflection. If on the contrary you have made yourself conscious sufficiently and then are able to make the transition gradually and bring that influence all the way into the physical, now you've brought something worthwhile to infuse in the physical consciousness to help its divinization. If nothing else, our first station for that would be the intuitive consciousness, intuitive mind, to intuitivize the physical. In order to prepare for that, you might want to mentalize the physical, but still it's not yet a spiritual exercise. That's still self-development. Intuitivizing would be a good step. Or a deeper opening to the inner of the psychic influence, or something into a wideness of the inner ranges, and to bring that into the physical consciousness so that the body feels, I am not just this narrow, I am actually widening and opening out to this. All this would be an essential part of the trajectory of the integral yoga and a necessity if you wish to divinize the physical consciousness. Now you could have these experiences and not bother with the divinization. I had a great experience, I came back, held memory, felt good, it faded out. Okay. It will still leave an imprint on the body. Your body will be different. It will tend to become more conscious. It will tend to develop a certain familiarity with those states, etc. You may not consciously intend to divinize it. But if you do, then this influence could now be that much more powerfully used. If you don't, it will still benefit, but that's about it. But having said all this, you don't need to have an out-of-body experience to be able to do this. You may do it purely as a process of consciousness. But with that process sufficiently developed to integrate, to be able to move across levels of consciousness, to infuse consciously into the physical, to move, to open, to experience things, act on those levels, etc., with or without infusion in the physical, would still be enough for the purpose of the integral yoga without needing to project out in an exteriorization, which is what we will call the out-of-body experience. What will tend to happen as a precursor to that would be a partial projection of consciousness would become natural. For example, it's an ability we all have already as we are. If you think intensely of somebody or a place that you've been to, the mother says a part of your mental consciousness is already there. And you can even feel in contact the state of mind of the other person. And this is normal to the mind as it is without any special effort. To be able to consciously register and not allow your preconceptions to mix in is part of the training to perceive accurately. So in a sense, can feel out someone, something, someplace on the other side of the world with your mental consciousness as it is. With a bit of training, you can feel out without mixture. That's about all. It's not a big deal. Was that an out-of-body experience? No. That was just a projection of the consciousness. And this can happen on many levels. Mental is easiest because it's the most plastic. On a slightly lower gradation of the vital or the mental vital, one could perhaps feel an emotional state of a person. But it would require a special skill to be able to feel or sense on a nearly physical level. This you would need to develop. We don't have it naturally. But if you paid attention, you could easily do it. Persistently, it's not difficult, it just needs persistence. So I make a distinction between difficult and requiring time. Some people have it naturally, some take longer, but it's not difficult, that's my point. So you can feel, let's say you choose now, if you've been to a place, let's say I have been to some part of the Himalayan region, the part which is, I've been to Badrinath, let's say. In your mind's consciousness, recall, relive, remember until a part of you literally feels as if you're there with the full vividness of it in your mental state. Then try to feel the vibrations of it almost on a material level. And there's a point where you'll feel as if you're almost on that level of density of sensation. And it's about, that's all it takes. It's not so difficult. You feel it. And if you do this as an active exercise without mixing too much of your preconceptions, you don't imagine, you don't visualize, you feel and perceive. There's a big difference. You'll notice, it feels warmer now. What happened? Oh, this is the warm season. You didn't know it, but you felt it. Or it feels extremely cold. Oh my God, this is so, it's all white. Well, it just so happens that it's snowing heavily. And it could be as simple as this. This would be a kind of a remote perception, remote viewing, you might say. But it is still a projection of consciousness or a partial projection of consciousness. And in the mental and the higher vital mental vital range, it's very easy. As I said, all of us have it as we are. It just needs a refinement of quality of perception and stillness of receptivity to perceive accurately and not mix with your preconception. And this is distinct from a stronger projection which should be of a vital or subtle physical range, which is again different from in your subtle physical body or vital body, separating, going out, doing something during which time your body is in a state of trance and coming back. Now, depending on the grade at which you have gone out, let's say it is the mental vital typically, or vital mental, that's the range more easy. You go out, you come back, it would be in terms of familiarity, not too different from the dream. In terms of experience, totally different because you are fully conscious. And as one could describe, once you have the experience, you feel like you're 100 times more conscious than in your waking state. You come back and you come back to a dulling influence. There again, if you did it consciously with an intention to infuse the higher grade of consciousness, you could help your physical body now grow into a greater consciousness. The mother also describes certain exercises that she has suggested where you actually go out of the body and turn upon your body to infuse into it certain grades of consciousness and things like that. So yes, how can it help? It can be helpful. Is it needed? No, because you can acquire the same experiences and develop the actual requirement of the integral yoga, including whatever influence you bring on the lower and opening of the higher and so on, without needing to exteriorize and go outside the body. The bulk of experiences of exteriorization are in the vital body. Typically, if you are reasonably more conscious in the higher ranges of the vital, that's about it. To project out in the mental body separate from the vital body is itself a difficult exercise, or a different exercise, let's put it. To go out in the subtle physical is difficult, extremely difficult, and that's when it can also be somewhat dangerous, because an injury there would reflect into the physical body. So this is just to show you that there's an actual large spectrum of experiences that would all be called out of body, as distinct from projection of consciousness, as distinct from lucid dream or dream, none of which are essentially required for the integral yoga, but all of which can be utilized, including becoming conscious in dream can be utilized. But you can do the entire integral yoga without needing to do this exteriorization either. So I hope that helps. I hope it did not confuse too much. I'm going to take a quick look at the chat box where there are several questions. Running Lawyer is asking, have you seen the interviews with Darius Wright, who practices out-of-body experience while in sleep paralysis? No, I have not. I don't know, but I will look and see if there's something. Shanta's asked question about ETs. Do they have access to Sri Aurobindo's writings? If I look at the example shared before of this person who approached the man in Brazil and quoted from the Bible, they have been observing and watching all of the wisdom, knowledge, spiritual traditions of the world, surely, some of them at least, not all. Those who have been watching Earth and being around for a while would definitely know about it. What they do with it, I do not know. But I remember also in one of the descriptions with a US military person who was in the Air Force base near Las Vegas, where he saw the tall whites. One of the things he asked those people is, he asked, obviously coming from the Christian tradition, do you know about Christ? And their comment was something like, oh, you mean incarnations of divinity? Yes, of course, every planet has its own incarnations of divinity. So, okay. Zain Rain is asking, what are your thoughts about Thoth and Emerald tablets? I don't know. It sounds like something which was channeled. If that be the case, I am very wary of such things. Anything channeled is generally unreliable and comes from the vital worlds. However interesting it might be, tends to be limited, if that be the case. But I don't know about this. V is asking, regarding people living in the past, how does one establish any kind of relationship with a person who is still playing out past relationships? It's as if there's no space for anyone or anything new. I think you mean by that someone who's living with a past relationship with another human and you're trying to come in there? Is that it? I don't know. But I will just generalize from this and say so much of what we do today is actually living in the past. And if you look at the English language itself, and it was something which struck me as a student when it was in some textbook that they said we were going to learn many tenses, but they started by saying most of what you will say and write will be in the past tense. And I thought to myself, why should that be? Interesting. Why should that be? Why can't we have a larger part of our conversation in the present tense or future tense? And I think it has to do with civilizational values. So much of our civilizational today on earth as human beings is looking back. What if, as a civilization, or let's say as a subgroup of earth humans, we are entirely turned to looking at the future? And everything we talk about is what we want to do, what we would like to do, what we will do, what's going to happen, and in relation to that, what we are currently doing. And occasionally from that, what we did, from which we can draw on what we are doing now and what we have to do next. I don't think it will make any difference practically to the richness of our conversation. I think it might even be much more interesting because we would use the past, but only in its relevance to the future. Think about it. Fascinating. And that's what would happen if you shift your consciousness to turn more forward rather than backward. So to the question, how does one establish any kind of relationship? It depends what your responsibility is. You could either first align to the past with them and then turn it by reference to its relevance to the future, or literally pull them out of that habit and force it into the present or future. All depends on the person, their proclivity and your responsibility towards them. But it's not difficult to make that shift. Even in a casual conversation, while everyone is talking about the past, you can skillfully, and it's a matter of skill, turn the conversation to the present or future. Sagar is asking, in some NDs, people are totally healed after their experience. Is that supramental consciousness which they touched? And after that they become so loving and diseases like cancer are completely gone. It need not be supramental consciousness. NDE is near-death experience. What Sagar is saying is that there are people who have had near-death experiences. So effectively they have died on the operating table or after an accident, gone out, been there in their subtle body, and then been sent back or pulled back. And they come back and they have been healed of certain experiences, of certain illnesses, and their consciousness has totally changed, they are more loving, more universal, etc., etc. Or there are a few examples where someone had a dream. So at night, this is a documented case I'm referring to now, this person who has multiple cancer which has metastasized, that means spread all over the body, they have only a few days to live, they have a dream experience, they go out, they have an experience with some higher being or a higher state of consciousness being in that world immersed, and then they're sent back, they come back to the body, they wake up, and the next day they have a test with the doctor and all the cancer is totally gone. And these are medically recorded cases, not one but a few of these. So is it an action of the supramental consciousness? Need not be. Whether it was, I will not comment. I would doubt very much, because the supramental already is a consciousness of infinity. And to have a direct experience of that would require you to have been much more than what this person was. But certainly the same thing can be done, this kind of radical healing, by even an exposure to the higher vital consciousness. It does not even need a spiritual consciousness. But certainly a spiritual consciousness would be that much more rapid, that much more complete, and would leave you changed in a more spiritual way. But the same thing could be done, my point is, even by a higher vital. What does happen, do you find the change in personality subsequent to a near-death experience or one of these kinds of spiritual experiences? Because having experienced that, it's like your boundaries in which you had locked yourself have now been broken. And so you are no more the same person. We have seen equally people like this. When the mother gave a spiritual experience to somebody, they came back so totally changed. I know of many cases, and the common feature among all of them was 3 days they were in a daze. And then after that they came back to their normal life, and then they still didn't know what to do with their lives because things had shifted so radically. Now this is not done normally to everybody. It is only done when somebody is ready, and then there's a receptivity enough that this can be given without seriously destabilizing. Otherwise, such a radical experience would tend to destabilize the personality, which is still not sufficiently formed, not sufficiently individualized, not sufficiently stabilized. But when that is there, and there is already a prior readiness and preparation from past work done in previous lives. One can just infuse an experience like this and suddenly things change and the person is no more the same. So very likely the persons who had these kinds of experiences, near death or otherwise, had already such a readiness. Otherwise, you could be given an equivalent even in a near death experience and still come back with very little carried over, very little actually received or contained, other than some vague impression, yes, it felt so good, and then I slowly fall back into my cantankerous self. So it's not that NDE will give you this. It's not that out of body will give you this. It's rather your readiness which makes that the trigger for something for which you were already ready. Maureen has this comment, dinosaurs are those who have been cooked, are still uneaten. Okay. I'm not sure I've understood, but... So RPX is asking, can we use hemisync music from Robert Monroe, which is non-drug based, for out-of-body experiences? And you can certainly. These are all attempts to use technological means to assist in having an out-of-body experience. And the hemisync is basically music in which you are playing slightly different phases of the same sound on both ears, of different phase, sometimes different frequency, but the difference being about the frequency needed to put your brain into the state of deep trance or sleep. Now, if that be the case, if your music is compressed to MP3 files, you can be sure that this layer is removed, because MP3 compression explicitly removes anything which is outside the audio range. So this is the mistake people make. You download Robert Monroe's music or instructions with that hemisync. I don't think you'll get the same effect, or you might get some partial effect. That being the case, even for those who have gone to Robert Monroe's training programs, not everyone gets an out-of-body experience. So yes, these things might be helpful, but to what extent? Only to help you go into that deep state of sleep, trance, rest. Other than that, nothing else. Other than that, at best it's a suggestion that says, okay, now you will drift off, and which you could do yourself. My point is, from a yoga point of view, you don't need all that. You can enter that state of complete stillness and rest, or equivalent of deep meditation, on your own. And if you can do that, get rid of those. They are very crude, superficial means to get to a state of deep relaxation. And you're more reliant on something which can only take you so far, when you can go directly much deeper by a conscious process of deep concentration or meditation. So my suggestion would be, don't bother with those technologies, they're not important. What could be used as an aid would be, and this is slightly different, is you go into deep state, but you have something which is like a bright enough light, or sometimes a flashing light, to ensure that you don't slip into sleep. And you stay in a deep state, close enough to sleep, or deep trance, or deep meditation, not slipping into sleep, because you're lying down. So even those of us who are used to meditating deeply, if you do it lying down, you might find yourself tending to slide into sleep. So light or a flashing light might help just enough to stimulate your system to not fall into sleep. Something like that might be useful, but again, it's a secondary reliance. Bruno is asking, can the experiences during concentration on the energy of the Divine Mother, the vital, mental and physical, letting go for the benefit of the psychic being, be assimilated to out-of-body experience? I'm not sure if I understand the question, but if I understand right, the state of being in concentration, in immersion in the Divine Mother, can it be used as a means for entering the out-of-body state? Yes, that can be done. So the basic requirement is to be able to take your whole consciousness into a state of deep rest, almost trance-like, what you would call deep sleep in the more superficial way. But if you're used to meditating, it can go into trance-like state of meditation. Having come to that, where your physical body is completely or closest to the state of sleep, but your consciousness is aware and awake, that's the ideal state in which the separation could take place if you decide to do that. But if you decide not to do that, you may from that state still access inner and higher ranges of consciousness equivalent to those worlds in which you could project out without actually projecting out. So, okay. We is sharing an example of a cat that would sleep on her lap during meditations. She was pregnant and then she found her journeying with her on non-earth locations, and the kitten turned out to be extraordinary. Yes, these things can happen. These are exceptional animals and they tend to gravitate to human beings, or they take births in animals close to human beings for this reason, for the support that they can get to prepare for the next human incarnation. Marine asks, I often do OBE during my naps, but I don't see any more the goal to explore the astral world. It is full of not so beautiful things, and I managed to access light planes only once. And I do not need to go in the astral. The vibrations directly sent me there with a beautiful blue sea, like a blue never seen before. Yes, the problem though is in this kind of a out-of-body experience, you will tend to go out on the level on which you are in your normal state of awareness. The first step is then to be able to go out. The second step would then be able to shift levels and to go into higher ranges. That is something which can be learnt, it can be taught, and maybe we'll touch upon that next time. I think this is broadly covering the questions which we had today. So it's a theme we have just begun, and I've titled it Dreams, Visions, Exteriorisations, which is the correct term for out-of-body experience. But everything else in between also we will cover in this, maybe 2 or 3 sessions on this topic. So, coming back to our focus, which is growth of our consciousness. Eventually, we are intended to become conscious participants in the entirety of the cosmos, all the planes. And such would be the nature of the supra-mental evolution. As supra-mental beings, you will have awareness on all planes equally. As mental beings, we have awareness of the mental plane, and to the extent we are embodied, it's mind consciousness and vital consciousness in the physical world only. But at least in dream state, we can explore or experience things of those planes. But as we become aware on those gradations of our being and integrate sufficiently, eventually all the way to the supramental, we would be conscious on all those planes and able to act on all those planes simultaneously while still being embodied in the physical substance. This would be the whole point of our incarnation and taking birth. Otherwise, we could have stayed in the mental body, experienced the mental worlds. You can even you can even wander into the spiritual ranges to the extent that you are evolved at least. You can wander into those ranges. But always your experience of reality will be those worlds only. As spiritual beings, we can even say we belong to Satchidananda and we could have just stayed there. But if you have not experienced these worlds all the way to the most material, you have not experienced the totality of the divine consciousness itself, which has chosen to materialize itself, isn't it? So we took an incarnation, we took a birth in the physical body in order that we can have the full spectrum of experience and act on all planes. But having come into the physical body, we as if lost access to all that, or we dulled ourselves to this, and from this dullness have begun the journey of rebuilding in physical body the higher ranges, which is the whole point of evolution. Once you understand this, you understand how precious incarnation in the body is. And although it is limiting, although it is dulling, It's the root, let's say, our lower anchor, for all the higher ranges to be infused into this, but then being in the body itself, the body awakened to those ranges and now embodying and incarnating them consciously. We would be in the physical world but also conscious of other worlds while acting here, with the full power of the entire cosmos and all worlds concentrated in the physical plane and expressing through a single integrated substance that is divinized, now embodying all planes and expressing through that. This experience is the unique feature of transformed physical body. You cannot have this equivalent on any other plane, only in the physical. That's what makes the physical incarnation and its divinization so worthwhile and worth all the trouble of the struggle of the billions of years of evolution that have brought us to where we are today, and promise all the rest that's imminent. Think about this, dwell on it, meditate on the idea, and perhaps you will get a glimpse of what it means, and that itself can be quite a beautiful experience. And then the promise of what awaits us becomes evident. And then we understand why we chose to incarnate and the work that we need to do. Let's take a moment to concentrate on this, on the divinized physical consciousness and the world that awaits us.